What if I told you that even after doing 5 years in federal prison, even after losing his freedom at the peak of his rap career, the federal government still hasn't taken its eyes off Pooh Shiesty for even a second? That while fans see a rapper who paid his debt to society, the feds see something very different, a walking criminal enterprise they believe never actually shut down. This isn't about one robbery, one shooting, or one bad decision. This is about a man prosecutors quietly classify as a long-term threat, someone they believe is capable of rebuilding an entire criminal network the moment the spotlight fades. Because here's the part most people don't understand. Prison didn't end Pooh Shiesty's story. To the federal government, it barely slowed it down. Behind the scenes, agents have spent years mapping his influence, tracing money trails, listening to coded conversations, and documenting violence they believe traces back to one source. They aren't just watching his moves, they're waiting for the smallest mistake, the tiniest parole slip, the one thread they can pull to unravel everything all over again. This is a story rooted in Memphis, a city the feds quietly describe as one of the most dangerous gang ecosystems in America. A place where organized street crews operate more like corporations than corner hustlers. A place where loyalty is tested in blood, and reputation is everything. And at the center of that world, according to prosecutors, is Pooh Shiesty, shaped by a father with deep criminal ties, trained from childhood in the rules of the street, and elevated by a rap career that allegedly became a weapon instead of an escape. By the end of this video, you'll understand why federal agencies believe Pooh Shiesty was never just a rapper, why they see his music as part of the problem, and why they're convinced this story isn't over, not even close. To understand why federal prosecutors believe Pooh Shiesty was never going to live a normal life, you have to understand the city that shaped him. Memphis isn't just another southern rap hub. To law enforcement, it's one of the most strategically dangerous cities in the country. It sits at the crossroads of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi, with major interstates cutting straight through neighborhoods that have been contested for generations. Drugs, weapons, and cash flow through Memphis non-stop, and for decades, federal agencies have quietly classified the city as a high-priority trafficking corridor. This isn't street chaos by accident. It's infrastructure. What separates Memphis from other cities is its gang ecosystem. Investigators estimate that more than 100 active gangs operate within a city of barely 500,000 people. Territories aren't just claimed by streets or blocks, but by rail lines, highways, and long-standing family ties. Violence isn't random. It's inherited. Kids don't grow up learning bedtime stories. They grow up learning who controls which side of town, what colors mean danger, and how fast you have to move when shots ring out. In neighborhoods like South Memphis, survival itself is a skill passed down from one generation to the next. This is the environment Pooh Shiesty was born into, and according to federal investigators, he wasn't just raised around crime, he was raised inside it. His father, known in the streets as Mob Boss, wasn't viewed as a small-time hustler. He was regarded as a figure with reach, someone whose name carried weight in both music and street politics. On the surface, he ran a record label. Behind the scenes, prosecutors allege he controlled drug distribution networks, enforced loyalty through violence, and built a reputation that made people think twice before crossing him. Law enforcement attention around Mob Boss intensified in the early 2000s, when a high-profile murder shook Memphis media circles. A popular radio DJ was killed under circumstances that never fully made sense. Officially, the crime was blamed on a lone individual. Unofficially, federal investigators began piecing together a much darker theory. They believed the murder sent a message, not just to the victim, but to anyone who stood in the way of certain interests. While direct proof remained elusive, what followed raised even more questions. Stolen property was used openly. Credit cards were spent without fear. To investigators, it looked less like panic and more like confidence. As the years passed, raids on properties connected to Mob Boss revealed operations that went far beyond casual street dealing. Detectives described trap houses fortified like military positions. Weapons weren't hidden, they were staged. Guard dogs were trained to attack intruders. Escape routes were planned. Cash wasn't pocket money, it was operating capital. These weren't people reacting to the streets. They were managing them. According to federal files, Pooh Shiesty wasn't shielded from this world. He was immersed in it. While other kids were learning math and spelling, investigators say he was traveling with his father, sitting in rooms where conversations weren't about music alone. Business meetings doubled as criminal planning sessions. Legitimate appearances provided cover. Music studios became safe spaces where surveillance was least expected. The lessons weren't theoretical. They were practical. By the time Pooh Shiesty reached elementary school, authorities believed the foundation was already laid. His first contact with the justice system came at an age most kids are worried about: recess. Details remain sealed, but prosecutors describe early behavior that showed planning, intimidation, and a lack of hesitation. School officials flagged him as a problem before his teenage years even began. Expulsions followed. Arrests escalated. Each incident reinforced a pattern rather than breaking one. Federal agents reviewing his juvenile history described something they found chilling: progression. Each year, the behavior intensified. What began as intimidation turned into robbery. What began as association turned into participation. By his early teens, investigators believe Pooh Shiesty wasn't just watching the criminal enterprise around him, he was being groomed to function inside it. Loyalty was emphasized above all else. Disrespect was treated as a threat. Violence wasn't framed as a last resort, but as a tool. When his mother attempted to remove him from Memphis by relocating to Texas, there was hope that distance might interrupt the cycle. For a brief period, the environment changed. The pace slowed. But federal analysts later concluded that the damage had already been done. The values had been installed. The worldview was set. When Pooh Shiesty returned to Memphis, he didn't come back reformed. He came back refined. High school became a turning point. Central High wasn't just a place for education. It was a convergence point for rival neighborhoods, rival crews, and rival ambitions. According to investigators, this environment forced a decision. Pooh Shiesty could rely on his father's name, or he could establish his own authority. Federal files suggest he chose the latter. This is where prosecutors say the groundwork for Choppa Gang was laid. Unlike traditional Memphis gangs rooted strictly in geography, this organization was built around personal loyalty. Allegedly, it wasn't about where you were from, it was about who you answered to. Firepower became part of the brand. High-powered rifles replaced handguns, not just for effectiveness, but symbolism. The message was escalation. Recruitment, investigators claim, was ruthless by design. Membership wasn't about numbers, it was about commitment. Violence served as a filter. Federal sources allege initiation standards that ensured anyone who entered was permanently tied to the group through shared guilt and irreversible acts. This structure made infiltration nearly impossible and loyalty almost absolute. By the time Pooh Shiesty was still barely out of his teens, prosecutors believe he had already transitioned from student to leader. He wasn't just participating in street activity, he was organizing it. Decisions weren't impulsive. They were strategic. And everything he had absorbed growing up, the blending of legitimate business with criminal operations, the use of reputation as protection, the exploitation of fear, began to take shape in his own image. This wasn't the rise of a rapper yet. It was the rise of an infrastructure. As that infrastructure solidified, federal investigators say the violence surrounding Pooh Shiesty became less chaotic and more deliberate. This wasn't the reckless behavior of someone acting out of impulse. It was calculated, measured, and designed to send messages. According to law enforcement assessments, Choppa Gang functioned less like a loose street crew and more like a command structure. Orders flowed downward. Information flowed upward. Mistakes were punished quickly, sometimes publicly, to reinforce discipline. The streets weren't just a backdrop anymore, they were a controlled environment. Prosecutors allege that shootings tied to the group followed a pattern. Targets weren't random. They were rivals who challenged territory, individuals who disrespected leadership, or people suspected of cooperating with authorities. Even when Pooh Shiesty wasn't physically present, investigators believe his influence was. Phone records, witness statements, and intercepted communications painted a picture of someone directing outcomes without needing to pull the trigger himself. To the feds, that distinction mattered. It suggested command responsibility. At the same time, music began to emerge as a parallel operation. What the public saw as a young artist chasing a dream, investigators allegedly saw as something more strategic. Studios offered privacy. Touring created plausible travel. Videos built reputation. Lyrics, prosecutors argue, weren't just entertainment. They were coded affirmations of power, warnings disguised as art, and recruitment tools aimed directly at young men drawn to violence and status. The image reinforced the myth, and the myth reinforced the control. When Pooh Shiesty aligned himself with major industry figures, federal interest intensified. To law enforcement, this wasn't a success story, it was an expansion. Money began moving faster. Jewelry, cars, and cash purchases multiplied. Investigators started tracing funds, looking for discrepancies between reported income and visible lifestyle. They believed music profits were being blended with street money, creating layers that made enforcement harder and prosecution more complex. The turning point, according to federal records, came with incidents outside of Memphis. Travel was supposed to represent growth. Instead, prosecutors say it exposed patterns that could no longer be ignored. Robberies allegedly connected to Pooh Shiesty's circle began surfacing in multiple states. The methods were consistent. The arrogance was notable. Victims were selected based on access and vulnerability, not chance. Firearms were used not just as weapons, but as tools of intimidation meant to guarantee compliance. One high-profile incident in Florida caught the attention of multiple agencies at once. What initially appeared to be a botched robbery quickly escalated into a federal case. Surveillance footage, shell casings, and witness accounts created a timeline investigators couldn't overlook. For the first time, prosecutors believed they had a clean entry point, an event they could isolate, document, and prove beyond reasonable doubt. The arrest that followed sent shockwaves through the industry. Fans were stunned. Critics were divided. But inside federal offices, the reaction was very different. This wasn't seen as the end. It was seen as the beginning. Investigators viewed the charges as leverage, an opportunity to apply pressure and observe how the network responded. Who stayed quiet? Who panicked? Who kept operating as if nothing had changed? While Pooh Shiesty sat in custody, authorities monitored communication channels closely. They weren't just watching him, they were watching everyone connected to him. According to prosecutors, the results confirmed their suspicions. Activity didn't stop. If anything, it adapted. Orders were allegedly relayed through intermediaries. Loyalty was tested. Enforcement continued. To the feds, this reinforced the belief that the organization was resilient and designed to survive leadership disruption. Sentencing brought temporary relief to the streets, but not to investigators. 5 years sounded significant on paper, but federal analysts understood time differently. Prison, in their view, doesn't always dismantle criminal networks. Sometimes it strengthens them. Incarceration can elevate status, deepen resentment, and provide new connections. For someone they believed already had influence, confinement was just another phase. Inside, prosecutors allege Pooh Shiesty remained a figure of interest. Intelligence reports suggested continued communication, coded messages, and influence that extended beyond the walls meant to contain him. Whether all of those claims could ever be proven in court is another matter. But to the agencies involved, the concern wasn't hypothetical. It was active. When release finally came, it wasn't viewed as freedom. It was viewed as a test. Parole conditions were strict for a reason. Every move mattered. Every association was scrutinized. Federal agencies coordinated quietly, sharing information and watching for patterns. They weren't waiting for a major crime. They were waiting for confirmation. The music world celebrated his return. The streets watched closely. But the government watched closest of all. To them, this wasn't a comeback story. It was the re-emergence of someone they believed had never truly left the game. A man shaped by violence, refined by structure, and empowered by influence. And as far as prosecutors were concerned, the question was no longer if Pooh Shiesty would cross a line again. It was when, and how much evidence they would need when he did. As federal agencies continued tracking Pooh Shiesty after his release, their focus shifted from individual incidents to patterns of behavior. They weren't looking for a single violation that would grab headlines. They were watching for consistency, repeated associations, subtle movements, financial signals, and communication habits that suggested old structures were reactivating. To investigators, criminal organizations rarely restart with violence. They restart with alignment. Who shows up? Who answers calls? Who suddenly has access they didn't have before? According to federal assessments, One of the first indicators was proximity. People long associated with Choppa Gang began resurfacing in the same spaces. Not publicly, not loudly, but predictably. Studio sessions doubled as reunions. Social media posts appeared harmless on the surface but were dissected frame by analysts trained to read subtext. A hand sign here. A lyric callback there. To fans, it was branding. To law enforcement, it was signaling. Money became the next focal point. Federal financial analysts started reviewing spending patterns tied to Pooh Shiesty's name and extended circle. The concern wasn't legal income from music. That part was expected. The concern was cash movement that didn't line up with standard industry behavior. Short-term loans repaid quickly. Jewelry purchases routed through third parties. Vehicles registered under names with no visible means to afford them. Individually, none of it proved a crime. Collectively, investigators believed it suggested the blending of streams all over again. They also paid close attention to enforcement dynamics. In Memphis, violence has a rhythm. When leadership changes, conflict usually follows. Turf disputes flare up. Power vacuums invite challenges. But in areas prosecutors believed were influenced by Choppa Gang, something different appeared to be happening. Disputes were resolved quickly. Retaliation was selective. There were fewer public displays, fewer impulsive shootings. To analysts, this didn't signal peace. It signaled control. Another concern centered on influence over younger individuals. Federal reports highlighted a recurring pattern. Teenagers and young men with no prior reputation suddenly acting with confidence, resources, and protection. Music videos showcased new faces. Lyrics referenced loyalty and consequences. Investigators believed these weren't coincidences. They believed they were watching a new generation being absorbed, using music culture as the entry point rather than street corners. The role of image became increasingly important. Pooh Shiesty's public narrative leaned heavily on growth, reflection, and redemption. Interviews emphasized lessons learned. Appearances were carefully curated. But prosecutors are trained to separate messaging from mechanics. Behind the scenes, they questioned whether the transformation was genuine or tactical. In their experience, the most effective operators understand optics. They know when to retreat publicly while consolidating privately. Surveillance expanded quietly. Federal agencies coordinated with local departments, pooling intelligence rather than competing for credit. This wasn't a rush case. It was a long game. Investigators documented movements across state lines, noting how often travel coincided with incidents involving people from the same circle. They tracked phone metadata, not content, looking for frequency spikes and contact clustering. Patterns mattered more than proof at this stage. What concerned them most was restraint. Historically, individuals with a reputation for violence struggle to adapt to limits. They overreact. They escalate. But prosecutors believed Pooh Shiesty was doing the opposite. He appeared disciplined, measured, almost patient. To seasoned investigators, that was a red flag. It suggested someone who understood the stakes and adjusted accordingly. They also studied how conflicts were handled indirectly. When disputes emerged, Pooh Shiesty rarely appeared connected on paper. Instead, associates handled interactions. Messages were relayed through layers. Decisions were insulated. This structure mirrored what federal agencies see in more sophisticated criminal enterprises. Systems designed to absorb pressure without exposing leadership. The music itself became another data point. Analysts listened to new releases not as fans, but as linguists. Changes in tone were noted. References to past actions faded, replaced by broader themes of dominance and inevitability. To prosecutors, this wasn't maturity. It was abstraction, a way to communicate power without specifics. They believed it reduced legal risk while maintaining influence. Meanwhile, community sources provided mixed signals. Some described Pooh Shiesty as staying out of trouble, focused on work. Others quietly warned that nothing had really changed, only the visibility. Federal agencies weigh these accounts carefully, knowing both can be true at once. A person can avoid personal exposure while still shaping outcomes. As months passed, frustration grew within certain circles of law enforcement. There was no clean violation. No obvious mistake. But the absence of chaos didn't reassure them. It reinforced their belief that what they were dealing with wasn't impulsive street crime, but something far more calculated. A structure designed to endure scrutiny. Internally, discussions shifted toward future strategy. If the goal was accountability, timing mattered. Move too early, and the case collapses. Wait too long, and damage spreads. Prosecutors debated thresholds. What would justify action? What would hold up under a jury's microscope? The standard wasn't suspicion. It was certainty. And through all of it, one idea kept surfacing in federal briefings. Influence is harder to prosecute than action. You can arrest a shooter. You can charge a robber. But proving command, proving direction, proving intent at a distance, that requires patience and volume. It requires letting a story tell itself over time. That's why, in the eyes of investigators, the most dangerous phase hadn't been the past filled with violence, or even the prison sentence that followed. The most dangerous phase was now. The phase where restraint masked ambition, where silence replaced noise, and where a man the public saw as redeemed was still being evaluated as a potential architect. Because if prosecutors were right, this wasn't a comeback era. It was a consolidation era. And history had taught them that consolidation always comes before expansion. By the time federal agencies reached that conclusion, their focus shifted again, away from whether Pooh Shiesty was actively committing crimes, and toward whether his presence itself functioned as a stabilizing force for something larger. Prosecutors often described certain individuals not as participants, but as anchors. Remove them, and chaos erupts. Leave them untouched, and systems quietly operate beneath the surface. According to internal assessments, Pooh Shiesty fit the second category far more than the first. This belief was reinforced by how little direct exposure he appeared to take. In earlier years, proximity to violence was obvious. Names surfaced. Scenes overlapped. But now, investigators noted a deliberate distance. He wasn't present when tensions flared. He wasn't connected on paperwork. He wasn't the loudest voice in any room. Instead, they believed he had learned the most important lesson his father's generation mastered long before social media existed. Survival depends on insulation. Federal analysts began mapping influence rather than incidents. They tracked who gained status after aligning with him, who seemed protected, who avoided consequences despite being repeatedly adjacent to problems. In criminal ecosystems, power often reveals itself not through action, but through absence of consequence. And in neighborhoods where retaliation once spiraled uncontrollably, order appeared to be maintained without public explanation. This raised a troubling question inside federal briefings. Was deterrence actually working, or was it being absorbed? Prison had removed Pooh Shiesty temporarily, but it may have also enhanced his reputation. To some, time served becomes proof of authenticity. To others, it becomes validation of leadership. Prosecutors worried that incarceration hadn't weakened his image, it had refined it. They also examined the broader cultural impact. Music tied to Pooh Shiesty continued to circulate in the same communities investigators monitored most closely. Lyrics echoed through cars, schools, and housing complexes already under strain. To law enforcement, this wasn't a moral argument about art. It was a practical one about messaging. Songs don't just entertain, they normalize. They frame behavior. They reward certain outcomes with status. And when those messages align with real-world structures, they amplify each other. Attempts to intervene indirectly followed. Increased patrols. Quiet pressure on associates. Financial audits that never became public. None of it produced a clear breaking point. Instead, it created what investigators described as a holding pattern. Everything slowed. Nothing stopped. And that stalemate created its own risks. Within federal circles, debates intensified. Some argued that continued observation without action allowed harm to spread unchecked. Others countered that premature arrests would collapse under scrutiny and strengthen the narrative of persecution. The balance between prevention and prosecution is one of the most difficult judgments in federal law enforcement. Move too fast, and you lose the case. Move too slow, and you lose control of the damage. What complicated matters further was the lack of a single defining event. There was no dramatic incident to rally around, no clear violation to justify escalation. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of indicators, subtle, circumstantial, but persistent. In isolation, each could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that refused to go away. Prosecutors also studied historical parallels. Figures who transitioned from visible violence to symbolic authority often followed the same trajectory. Early chaos, mid-career consolidation, late-stage insulation. In those cases, law enforcement's biggest regret was not acting sooner, not because evidence was weak, but because patience allowed networks to deepen roots that became nearly impossible to uproot later. Still, proof is the currency of the courtroom, not intuition. And federal cases aren't built on belief. They're built on documentation, testimony, and time. So the watch continued. Quietly, relentlessly. Every association remained logged. Every movement noted. Every financial anomaly archived. Investigators understood that influence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates until it crosses a threshold where denial is no longer plausible. Their task wasn't to predict the future, it was to be ready for it. Meanwhile, the public narrative drifted further away from the government's internal one. Fans saw progress, growth, a rapper attempting to redefine himself after paying his debt. That disconnect concerned prosecutors deeply. Public perception can complicate prosecution, especially when sympathy enters the equation. A defendant framed as redeemed is harder to convince a jury is dangerous. Yet federal agencies are accustomed to operating without validation. Their role isn't to align with popularity, but with prevention. And in their assessment, the danger wasn't hypothetical. It was structural. A person with reach, resources, and credibility in environments already prone to violence represents a multiplier effect. Even without direct orders, influence alone can tilt outcomes. By this stage, the question inside federal offices was no longer about guilt or innocence in a single case. It was about risk. How much risk does a society tolerate before intervention becomes necessary? And who decides where that line is drawn? For now, that line remained uncrossed. But it was being measured constantly. Because in the federal view, the most telling moments aren't the loud ones filled with sirens and headlines. They're the quiet ones where nothing seems to be happening at all. Where stability hides motion. Where restraint conceals preparation. And if their analysis was correct, the story of Pooh Shiesty wasn't defined by his past or even his present. It was defined by what his position allowed to happen around him, unseen, undocumented, and unresolved. Which is why, even without an arrest, even without a charge, even without a headline, federal agencies continued to treat him not as a finished chapter, but as an ongoing case. Because in their experience, the most dangerous phase of any criminal figure's trajectory is the one where everyone else believes the story is over. The story of Pooh Shiesty is more than headlines, more than music, more than social media posts. It's a cautionary tale about the real costs of a life built on crime. Fame and fortune can't shield you from consequences, and influence carries responsibility whether you embrace it or not. For young people watching from the sidelines, the lesson is clear. Shortcuts through violence, drugs, and manipulation lead to temporary gains but long-term losses that no amount of money or notoriety can erase. The federal government's relentless pursuit of figures like Pooh Shiesty isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting communities, sending a message that crime has consequences, and showing that real success comes from legitimate paths, not shortcuts. Learn from the story, make better choices, and understand that true power lies in building, not destroying.